So let it be known that as the Christmas pageant literally waits in the wings, that my own child just grimaced when he understood that I was going to preach before that began. So message received. And we arrive today at this third Sunday of Advent, and there is much to be said. We light the pink or the rose candle on our Advent wreaths, and we can see the pink and the rose flowers up on the altar. Because today we are invited to rejoice, to sing with Mary and proclaim the greatness of our God. We hear from the prophet Isaiah that even the desert is being transformed and shouting songs of joy. All of creation is alive and blossoming with the hope that God is breaking into the world, that God is stirring up God's power and coming amongst us. How can we keep from singing? And our children are going to lead us today in proclaiming the good news. Soon, and I promise very, very soon, the angels, the multitude of the heavenly hosts, are going to overwhelm as they run down this aisle. And we are going to sing the familiar hymns as the story unfolds. Joy, as our children show us what it looks like when God shows up. And so on this Rejoice Sunday, we look to the gospel lesson. And perhaps we're surprised because we find John the Baptist in prison. Maybe not what we were expecting on Rejoice Sunday. This feels a far cry from Isaiah's blossoming desert. In fact, it feels barren and parched. John is broken and in despair. The one called to prepare the way of the Lord, the one who leapt for joy in his mother's womb at the presence of the baby, his cousin, in Mary's womb, the one at home in the wilderness, in the wild, eating locusts and wild honey and speaking the promises of God. Now confined, detained, suppressed, and defeated, sending words to Jesus in songs of misery. Are you the one who is to come? Or are we to wait for another? John's question is our question too on this Rejoice Sunday. From our own cells of brokenness and despair, whatever they may be, from all of the places, the very real places where hope and dreams are imprisoned, from the barren and parched places, all of creation calls out to Jesus, are you the one who is to come? Or are we to wait for another? And Jesus sends word back. Or rather, Jesus sends story back. Because that is how Jesus is made known. In story, in word, from the beginning. Not by edict or pronouncement, but by sharing the stories of how the promises that John and the prophets proclaimed in the wilderness are being made known. The stories of how the world is being healed and transformed. The stories of where the rose is blossoming in the desert. The stories of how the blind see and the lame walk and the leper is cleansed and the deaf hear and the dead are raised. The stories of how the poor know and experience good news. Jesus sends the stories back to the place of brokenness and despair. Jesus sends the good news to the places where the powers and principalities have feigned victory. Jesus responds to John with nothing short of the story of himself. Because the story, the word, defies despair with shouts of joy. Again, as we hear today from the prophet Isaiah, be strong, do not fear. Shouts of defiant joy in the most unlikely of places. Like from the mouth of a young girl, a young mother who cannot help but sing as she bears God into a world that knows such brokenness. Today we rejoice with Mary in the words of her song of the Magnificat. We proclaim with Mary the greatness of our God. And John's story will continue to be a broken one. John will remain in prison and be executed and never again know the wilderness that he loves so much. And John knows the story. John knows the word. John lives the promises. And the end will not be the end for John. The tomb of his prison cell will become a womb, much as the one he knew when he leapt for joy within his mother, sheltering the new life that he will know at his death, the fullness of God's promise that he did not know in his life, healing and wholeness. And we don't actually have that part of John's story. We don't have the next part of how John responds after his disciples have come to him and shared the stories of Jesus. But I like to imagine that as John received those stories, as he heard them again, as he heard the good news of all the places where God was breaking in, where Jesus was healing and proclaiming, that John knew that he had done his work of preparing the way well. That even right there on the cold floor of the prison cell, John felt the wilderness blooming. And that his soul leapt for joy, and that maybe even once more he said aloud for anyone who could hear, "Prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight." Because John knew that Jesus was the one, as clearly then on the prison floor as when he leapt in his mother's womb. And so we rejoice today. We rejoice not because we take a break or turn away from the places of brokenness and despair that we know individually and corporately. We rejoice today because it is exactly those places that the story of Jesus is proclaimed. It is for those places. And so we shout the good news in the desert, and we watch for abundant blossoms. And it is at this point that the little and not so little children will lead us.